There's a lot of confusion about the H1N1 swine flu pandemic, its seriousness, and the safety of the vaccine recommended to prevent it. So we're going to clear up these issues, and we're going to help you determine how to take the right action to protect yourself and your loved ones. So how about just starting out with defining what the flu is?
A lot of people get confused about what the flu is. You know, they think that every cold that we get is a flu. So we have colds and flus, and we get confused by what it means. But there is something called influenza, and influenza is different from just an ordinary cold. It's a specific kind of virus that causes something called influenza. So that's what we're talking about today, is the different forms of influenza. And actually, there are three different kinds. There's type A, type B, and type C. So we'll learn about the ABCs, okay, of what influenza is about. Type A by far is the most important, because this is a virus that's shared, okay? Humans can get it, birds can get it, chickens get it, horses get it, seals get it, whales get it. These are all vectors that can pass along the virus.
How do we get it from one of these animals?
Well, you may not. You may just get it because there's a human epidemic, okay? And in type A, it's passed back and forth sometimes, and we'll get to what that means in a minute. There's also type B, which is only epidemics in human beings. Animals don't get it. And type C is a very uncommon sort of influenza that is very mild influenza that doesn't really cause any damage to anybody. So the big culprit is type A. And in type A, if an animal gets it, it becomes sick, and it gets sick like a human does. It may get a cough or sore throat and sneeze and have a problem with a pneumonia sometimes, or with some GI symptoms. And normally, it just passes back within species of that particular animal. So if birds get it, it's a bird flu. If swine get it, it's a swine flu. And that is something that they get, but they don't pass along to us normally. But there is a form of spread from an animal, okay, like that, to a human being that occurs, but only between the animal and the human being. So once we get it from the animal, that's called zoonotic spread of the virus. We can become sick with that virus, but other people don't get sick from it. So we don't pass it back and forth to people.
But now we hear sometimes about the avian or the bird flu when people are taking care of chickens, when they're workers, and that's what their job is.
That's a zoonotic spread. It's directly from the animal to the human being. But when the human being gets it, it doesn't pass from human being to human being. It stays localized in just the one person.
So how does it happen then that we end up with this flu that we have now, the H1N1, they call it the swine flu? How did we end up getting this combination? What is the combination of the viruses?
Right, well, that's a combination of several viruses, actually. It's a combination of the 1918 Spanish flu. It's also a combination of the avian or bird flu and of swine flu. So what happens in that situation is
Oh, wait a second, though. How did we ever get a flu that was this combination?
Well, that's a mystery. I mean, there's a lot of talk about that. What public health people have done is just assume that it's some freak of nature that has caused that to occur. And there are people who are conspiracy people who think that maybe it was made in a test tube somewhere in a laboratory, and maybe it got loose, or maybe it was put loose on purpose. Nobody really knows. So those are just theories that people talk about, but that's not what we're really going to get into today. Now, when somebody has a virus that has been gotten from an animal, or if an animal, for example, gets a pig gets an avian flu, a bird flu, and there's an exchange of genetic material between the two influenza viruses, sometimes it can be passed along to a human, and then it can be spreading from human to human. These are the dangerous ones, because lots of things have to happen. They're unlikely to happen. That's why we've only had 4 major epidemics in the last 100 years, roughly, last 90 years.
So the genes are swapping or something?
Exactly. There's a mixing of the genes between these different kinds of flu viruses that form a concoction that not only passes from the animal to a human being, but from human being to human being. And that's what we worry about. And because these viruses are so different, human beings have never had them before.
So we wouldn't have any antibodies for them.
We wouldn't have any protection. So when you get it, if it happens to be a virus that's very transmissible, it may cause an epidemic, and that may cause a pandemic. An epidemic meaning something that occurs locally or in the country or in the state. And a pandemic is something that spreads from country to country to country all over the world.
So right now, everybody's, not everybody, but a lot of people are scared right now because the news media is saying that we have a pandemic, and the World Health Organization is talking about it. And it's a grade 6 pandemic, which means it's the worst pandemic.
Yeah.
However, it's not really the severity of this particular virus, it's the prevalence of this particular virus.
That's right.
So, in other words, it's kind of like a flu.
It's not like a cold. The World Health,
yeah, that's what I meant to say.
The World Health Organization is following a cold, just like the CDC is. To me, it's like, why are they bothering to track this?
I mean, this
Who
would
cares
be really,
how widespread it is?
This would be really serious if it was some horrible, horrible bug that was like the bubonic plague or something. And like you said, if it's basically a cold, and there's like a lot less deaths that happen from this H1N1 swine flu than happen with, say, the seasonal flu.
Exactly.
Because the numbers are, I think it's 10 times more people die from the seasonal flu than from this H1N1 swine flu.
Yeah, well, that's right. The CDC says there are 36,000 deaths every year from seasonal influenza. That number is exaggerated for sure. I mean, that number is not that big. We don't hear about 36,000 deaths.
Well, one of the problems, I think, is a lot of people say they have the flu when they have a virus. I mean, there's tons of different viruses.
Well, they lump together all those issues. They'll lump together people who have influenza with people who die from pneumonia from any cause. When you lump them all together, you get a number that's a lot bigger than if you just identified every person who had a particular flu. And when you look at the numbers, okay, of deaths that there have been from the swine flu, it's in the range of maybe 300, a few more or less than that. That's not an epidemic when you consider the fact that the CDC says there are 36,000 deaths from influenza. And when you lump together pneumonias in that, and you look at that globally, do you know how many deaths there are from pneumonia every year in the world? That number is staggering. It's 2.5 million deaths a year. And now we're all of a sudden alarming ourselves over 300 deaths a year, or deaths so far in the last 6 months from the swine flu. That's not an epidemic, I'm sorry. And then we talk about taking drastic actions, and what we're doing is basing a lot of the action we're taking on fear. We're scaring the hell out of Americans, telling them that the swine flu is a deadly thing, and it's a lie. It's not a deadly thing.
Well, it's starting to sound like it's about trying to sell vaccines. Tell us, and let's go over for a minute about what happened in 1976 with the swine flu.
Yeah, that's another great example. There was one death from a soldier in Fort Dix and 3 or 4 other people that got sick. And everybody got excited about it and said, this is a big problem. We have to worry about what's happening because somebody died. So they went out and mass-produced this virus against the swine flu. And without testing it, they just start administering it to everybody that they could. Now, there weren't any more deaths from the swine flu, but there were 25 deaths from the vaccine. And there were lots of people who filed claims against the government for complications, probably 1,000 people or more.
Well, I read something where there were 4,000 lawsuits going on. There were a lot of people that ended up with Guillain-Barré syndrome. That's a really serious central nervous system paralysis where, I mean, you've got a tracheotomy, you're on a respirator, you can't move, you can't talk.
And this is for months. And so it often has disabilities that go with it. So it turned out that the vaccine was far more dangerous, and that we panicked too early, and that we gave people a vaccine that wasn't tested. And so they stopped giving it after they'd given something like 40 million doses. So we know that we have to be careful about doing things like that. And the scenario that we have today is the same thing. We're coming out with a vaccine that's not been tested, that we're testing maybe for 6 weeks to try and get some studies on. We have no idea if it's going to work. All we know is that that vaccine is going to make antibodies against the virus that's in the vaccine, the killed virus that's in the vaccine.
And we don't really even know. We don't even know yet. They haven't even done the studies to show if that prevents the flu anyway.
Well, you wouldn't know until you